An early winter morning in 1944, thick fog drifted silently over the waters of Leyte Gulf. Aboard the USS Nashville, the flagship of the Allied forces in the Western Pacific, the air inside the briefing room felt heavy, almost still. Maps lay spread across the table. Radio signals were being translated onto paper. Voices lowered to a hush. And at the head of the table, General Douglas MacArthur wore his familiar, unreadable calm, but in his eyes, something had just shifted. A decision had passed. Only a few understood what was unfolding. Intelligence channels were being quietly rerouted. Certain reports no longer crossed familiar desks. Names that once circulated freely within the command structure began to fade from the flow of directives. It all happened as gently as mist, but to those who had spent years inside this war machine, the signs were unmistakable. MacArthur was slowly pulling Major General Charles A. Willoughby out of the spotlight. Willoughby had been the one helping him read enemy intent, choose the right moment to strike, and, most importantly, build advantage before a single shot was fired. The campaign to retake the Philippines, the landings at Leyte, bore the clear imprint of the intelligence apparatus he oversaw. But from this moment forward, Willoughby would no longer stand at the heart of command decisions. The shift came without announcement, without noise, yet left an absence obvious enough to raise the question: why was MacArthur distancing himself, step by step, from the very man who had helped him win the most decisive battle of the Pacific campaign? And the harder question: what, exactly, was he trying to protect? To understand that, we must begin with the very man who had just disappeared from the center of command, the man who once stood very close to the center of power, yet always remained outside the frame. Major General Charles Andrew Willoughby, Director of G2 Intelligence, was an indispensable part of the strategic operating machinery of the Southwest Pacific area. Of German origin, naturalized as an American, and a veteran of World War I, Willoughby entered World War II with a thick record and a hard, discreet working manner. From the earliest days in the Philippines in 1939, he had already been MacArthur's silent right hand. Through the campaigns in New Guinea, the Bismarck Sea, and then the moment of the recapture of Leyte, Willoughby was responsible for the entire chain of intelligence analysis and processing, from code-breaking and assessing enemy intentions to shaping operational objectives. In the eyes of many officers, he was not an easy man to approach, but in MacArthur's eyes, he was a man who brought reassurance, someone who knew what needed to be said and what should be left untouched on the table. The relationship between the two was not simply that of superior and subordinate, it leaned more toward a form of politically grounded trust. MacArthur needed someone of absolute loyalty, and Willoughby knew how to serve in alignment with his superior's line of thinking. But that very closeness also caused professional boundaries to gradually blur. The more Willoughby understood what MacArthur wanted, the more his intelligence assessments moved closer to expectation. And when an intelligence officer begins to anticipate a commander's preferences rather than follow the data, his role gradually shifts from one who issues warnings to one who reinforces belief. The question raised at this point is not only, what did Willoughby do that led MacArthur to create distance, but also, from when did the provider of information begin to become a threat to the narrative that the general wanted to control? Willoughby did not appear before the camera, but his influence was most clearly visible on the map, in the arrows drawn from information gathered through hundreds of different channels: radio intercepts, guerrilla sources, prisoner interrogations, signal decrypts. From inside the conference room, he helped shape the way MacArthur saw the battlefield. In his role as Director of Intelligence, Willoughby was responsible for the entire process of collecting and analyzing data on the enemy to support decision-making. That capability became clearly evident during the New Guinea campaign of 1942-1943. At the end of April 1942, Allied ultra-intelligence decrypted a major Japanese plan. Initially, Willoughby misjudged the direction, believing the enemy would push deep to the south, aiming at Australia or the island of New Caledonia. But, as additional information poured in during the first week of May, he adjusted his assessment in time, identifying the true objective as Port Moresby, Papua. Allied forces rapidly redeployed their defensive positions. The result was the Battle of the Coral Sea, where Japan's first seaborne offensive was successfully intercepted. At the end of April 1942, Allied ultra-intelligence decrypted a major Japanese plan. Initially, Willoughby misjudged the direction, believing the enemy would push deep to the south, aiming at Australia or the island of New Caledonia. But, as additional information poured in during the first week of May, he adjusted his assessment in time, identifying the true objective as Port Moresby, Papua. Allied forces rapidly redeployed their defensive positions. The result was the Battle of the Coral Sea, where Japan's first seaborne offensive was successfully intercepted. Immediately afterward, he continued to closely track enemy intentions in Papua, detecting signs of preparations to attack positions such as Buna and Milne Bay, enabling the Allies to plan their defences in advance. These contributions earned Willoughby the Distinguished Service Cross, one of the highest awards granted to staff officers. Entering the years 1943, 1944, MacArthur began implementing the leapfrogging strategy, bypassing heavily fortified strongpoints to strike weaker links in the Japanese defensive system. To do so, intelligence needed to identify precisely two factors: where the weak points lay, and when the most favorable moment to strike would be. Willoughby played a direct role in the operational analyses that answered both questions. In early 1944, Japanese forces withdrew from several positions along the northern coast of New Guinea. Collected documents indicated that a large force was concentrating in Hansa Bay, while Itape and Hollandia showed clear vulnerabilities. Willoughby confirmed this in reports submitted to headquarters. MacArthur concurred. In April, U.S. forces carried out 2 amphibious landings at Hollandia and Itape, encountering virtually no significant resistance. Within a matter of days, the 2 strategic bases fell into Allied hands, severing the supply lines of tens of thousands of Japanese troops in the eastern sector. Not long before that, during the campaign to seize the Admiralty Islands, February 1944, Willoughby had offered an assessment that ran counter to Air Force Commander George Kenney. Kenney believed that Los Negros Island had been abandoned, but Willoughby, relying on decrypted data, asserted that roughly 3,000 Japanese troops were still holding out there. MacArthur ultimately chose the option of a prepared assault. Events proved that the Japanese resisted fiercely and inflicted heavy casualties. But thanks to Willoughby's accurate assessment, U.S. forces were not taken by surprise. The outcome was a key victory that flung open the northern gateway of New Guinea and created a springboard for subsequent operations. By the most critical phase of the Philippines campaign of 1944-1945, Willoughby continued to hold a central role. Prior to the landing on Leyte in October 1944, he directed the intelligence network to work closely with Philippine guerrilla forces to redraw the map of Japanese defensive deployments. Reports showed that the enemy's central line was beginning to weaken. That assessment formed the basis for MacArthur's decision on the timing of his return, fulfilling the promise, "I shall return," that had endured for more than 2 years. The reality at Leyte, and later on Luzon, showed that the fighting was anything but easy. Yet it was the intelligence system that enabled U.S. headquarters to prepare relatively thoroughly for troop dispositions, directions of counterattacks, and even the scale of potential casualties. Despite inaccuracies in estimates, Willoughby believed Japanese forces on Luzon numbered only about 172,000. While the actual figure approached nearly 290,000, MacArthur still chose to place his trust in the assessment because the entire campaign had been prepared around that belief. Every report, every red-marked map laid out on the operations table bore Willoughby's fingerprints. He did not win battles, but he supplied the data that allowed others to strike at the right moment, and in modern warfare, that can sometimes make the difference between a retreat and a successful landing. From the outside, the relationship between MacArthur and Willoughby was often seen as a perfect pairing, one the face of power at the front, the other the quiet brain operating behind the scenes. Together, they moved through nearly all the decisive campaigns of the Southwest Pacific, from the desperate defense of the Philippines to the seizure of the initiative at Leyte. Yet beneath that surface of cooperation and loyalty lay a fissure both men clearly understood, even if neither ever spoke of it aloud. MacArthur was a commander who lived by intuition and image. He did not accept his decisions being shaped by another hand, even when that hand belonged to intelligence. Willoughby was the opposite. He believed in analytical structure, in systems, and in the ability to control risk through precise information. At first, these two modes of thinking complemented one another. Over time, however, they produced a quiet collision. One man using information to explain the battlefield, the other using the battlefield to reinforce his own image. MacArthur once told his subordinates, "Intelligence is not a reference channel. It is a springboard for issuing orders. Whoever controls information shapes the war." For him, who was allowed access to which data was not merely a technical matter, it was a question of power, and to preserve absolute authority, MacArthur gradually built a closed circle of control around himself. He blocked all efforts by the OSS, the US, Strategic Intelligence Service and precursor of the CIA, to establish an independent network within his command area. He issued orders that all reports from Ultra, the system decrypting Japanese radio communications, had to pass through his hands first. Only he and Chief of Staff Richard Sutherland were permitted to read the full texts. Even the official director of intelligence, Willoughby, was excluded from the distribution list. One day in June 1943, when Willoughby entered the communications room and asked for an Ultra report, Rudy Fabian, the Navy officer in charge of the Frumel station, said nothing. He simply took the decrypted sheet from Willoughby's hand, dropped it into the incinerator, then pushed the ashes into a waste bin directly beneath Willoughby's desk. The act violated no standing order, but it delivered a message everyone understood. MacArthur's G2 had been pushed outside the circle of trust, at least in the most critical domain of strategic intelligence. Willoughby did not react. He filed no protest, requested no restoration of access. In a system where loyalty often mattered more than accuracy, silence was the most prudent response. Yet from that moment on, he knew that his true power, the power to see before others decided, was no longer intact. The problem did not stop at access to information. As time went on, MacArthur increasingly came to see that Willoughby was beginning to make assessment errors that were difficult to accept. In the summer of 1942, when Japanese forces began crossing the Owen Stanley Range to advance toward Port Moresby, Willoughby, together with MacArthur and even the Australian General Blamey, believed such a move to be impossible. No one, they assumed, would be reckless enough to send an entire division through treacherous jungle mountains along the Kokoda Track. But the Japanese did go, and not only did they make it through, they nearly succeeded. Port Moresby was saved only by belated counterattacks and at a very high cost in manpower. For an intelligence officer, a mistake of that kind could be explained once, but for MacArthur, who viewed data as a springboard for establishing strategic conviction, it planted a doubt that lingered. A few months later, Willoughby again underestimated enemy strength during the Lac des Amis and Biak campaigns. MacArthur had believed those operations would be light and swift, yet in reality they encountered far stronger resistance than anticipated, inflicting heavy losses on US forces and forcing changes to subsequent attack plans. MacArthur did not need apologies. He only needed to know whom he could no longer trust completely. And Willoughby, though he did not lose his position, no longer retained the strategic guiding role he once held. In a private meeting, when an officer asked how he assessed the capabilities of the G2 director, MacArthur replied coldly, "The history of intelligence recognizes only 3 true geniuses, and Willoughby is not among them." Shortly afterward, he still sent Willoughby a private message, offering reassurance. The intelligence of 6th Army is far worse. It was a gentle way of preserving loyalty while quietly stripping away real influence. After the war, This process of separation became even more apparent. MacArthur was appointed Supreme Commander for the Allied occupation of Japan, a position demanding political skill, social administration, and the construction of a civilian image. Willoughby, with a war-centric mindset and an outdated aristocratic temperament, was ill-suited to appear in reform efforts. Instead, MacArthur placed his trust in General Courtney Whitney, who oversaw constitutional reform, the drafting of civil law, and relations with Japanese leaders. Willoughby, meanwhile, was assigned responsibility for security, press censorship, and the maintenance of order tasks with less visibility, easier to control, and most importantly, removed from the decisions that would shape MacArthur's post-war legacy. For MacArthur, Willoughby was a tool that had served effectively during the war years, a man he could rely on to legitimize tactical decisions and maintain a closed information structure. But he also understood that once the war ended, someone who knew too much and had stood too close to the center of power could become a threat to the story that would ultimately be written. And in the version of history MacArthur was constructing for himself, where every victory flowed from personal vision and will, there was no room for another name to appear in the opening lines. Willoughby was still there, still holding the rank of Major General, still sitting in meetings. But he had been cut off from the main streams of information, was no longer consulted on major changes, and his name gradually disappeared from speeches of praise. MacArthur did not need to dismiss Willoughby. He merely needed to reset the system so that the man who once stood behind him now stood behind another door, soundproofed, quiet, and far enough away not to dim the central light. In August 1945, in Manila, during the final days of the war, Willoughby still sat at the main table beside Allied representatives, taking part in the process of receiving the Japanese delegation's surrender. In every archival photograph taken that day, he appears in a shadowed corner often to the left of the frame, his head slightly bowed, his eyes following the lines of text being translated into Japanese. That position, whether by chance or by design, accurately reflected the trajectory of his career, close to the center of power, yet never in the spotlight, and from that moment on, time itself began to slip from Willoughby's grasp. The war ended, but the relationship between him and MacArthur did not. Both men moved into the next chapter, the Korean War. Willoughby continued to serve as Director of Intelligence, not because his abilities were reassessed and renewed, but because MacArthur needed someone familiar, loyal, and predictable. But the Korean battlefield was not a replica of the Pacific. This was a theater where a single misjudgment could alter not only operational maps, but the global strategic balance. By late 1950, U.S. forces were approaching the Yalu River. Multiple sources from prisoner interrogations and ground reconnaissance to SIGINT intercepts indicated that China had deployed large forces across the border. Yet Willoughby, in one way or another, continued to submit optimistic assessments to MacArthur, asserting that even if Chinese troops were present, they were only small advisory groups, insufficient to mount a large-scale counteroffensive. He did not deny the data outright, but consistently embedded soft conclusions in his reports to reassure the commander. And MacArthur, as he had so often before, chose to believe what he wanted to hear. When asked for his opinion, he even assured President Truman that if China intervened, the number of troops would not exceed 50,000. In reality, nearly 300,000 Chinese soldiers crossed the river in silence, encircled, struck by surprise, and forced United Nations forces into a chaotic retreat in freezing conditions, one of the most severe defeats suffered by the United States since the beginning of the century. Willoughby was not publicly blamed, but no one was confused about his role in that chain of misjudgments. When MacArthur was dismissed by President Truman in April 1951, the chair beneath Willoughby slid away as well. In September of the same year, he submitted his resignation and left the army after 35 years of service without a farewell ceremony, without thanks from the Pentagon, and without any new assignment waiting. He vanished quietly from the map of power, as if he had never been there at all. In later years, Willoughby lived a discreet life. He ran a small intelligence analysis magazine called Foreign Intelligence Digest until the early 1960s, occasionally attended specialist conferences, and eventually published a self-written memoir about MacArthur that retained the same reverent tone he had shown as a subordinate. But history, like the military scholarly community, no longer reserved a place for him among those who shaped the Second World War. His name appears rarely in academic studies, and when it does, it is often accompanied by the phrase controversial intelligence. No one completely denies his contributions. During the period 1942–1944, Willoughby was a necessary cog in MacArthur's intelligence machinery. He understood his commander, knew how to condense what his superior wanted to hear, and ran the information system in ways that supported the distinctive leapfrogging strategy of the Southwest Pacific. But that very method of working established a dangerous precedent. Information was no longer independent, but adjusted to strategic will from above. The result was that when a new enemy emerged, one that was unpredictable and did not follow old patterns, that self-created bubble shattered immediately. Many later analysts have called this mirror intelligence, when the analytical apparatus no longer reports reality, but instead reports what superiors wish to have confirmed. In Willoughby's case, his greatest mistake may not have been his loyalty to MacArthur, but that he forgot loyalty to victory sometimes requires the courage to say what the boss does not want to hear. History will likely remember MacArthur as a supreme commander of great achievements and great controversy. But Willoughby, the man who once stood just behind him at the table receiving Japan's surrender, who once analyzed every enemy defensive line, who once redrew the map of New Guinea through crackling radio signals, was left behind, suspended in the space between triumph and error. One historian once remarked, "MacArthur had a #1 intelligence man, but no one is quite sure where Willoughby himself ranked." And that line, though ironic, may be the most precise cut into the fate of an officer who once knew too much, yet is remembered too little. In every war, behind spectacular victories lie carefully calculated choices not only of strategy, but of people. The case of General Charles Willoughby is a clear cross-section of that hidden side. MacArthur did not remove him out of personal resentment or open disagreement, but because informational power, an invisible yet essential asset in wartime, must always be kept under the absolute control of the man at the top. Willoughby, driven by the ambition to remain close to the center of power, chose loyalty over truthfulness, chose to align with his superior's intuition rather than uphold the professional principles of intelligence. His career therefore rose through another man's authority and declined by that same hand. History views him as a textbook example of the paradox of battlefield intelligence. Data only has value when it is received without bias, and when the commander is willing to confront reality, no matter how uncomfortable. MacArthur's gradual narrowing of the space for dissent around himself began with the isolation of the very man who had helped him see the battlefield clearly, and in the end, this not only exacted a price in career, but also left a lasting void in the structure of modern command. Willoughby is not remembered as a genius, but he stands as a stark reminder that, in any command system, the cost of one-dimensional thinking lies not in margins of error, but in strategic blind spots. And sometimes, that cost is only revealed after every order has already been issued.